given some trade-offs on decentralization, people can get real utility out of these networks. Like people are using DePIN products today at scale, and they're useful and they're low cost. And so these three things I think are clear for investors. The space definitely has heated up a lot over the past year.
When we were designing this protocol, we talked to a variety of miners and said, listen, your problem isn't only the price falls and people can't support their network and can't support their cost. The problem is the price goes up so much, they don't want to do any actual work. And so we wanted to design something where we attracted people that view this as utility and are not just in it for a moonshot in terms of return.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Proof of Coverage podcast. Today, super happy to have with us Tom Trowbridge. He's the founder of Fluence and has been building in crypto and in DePIN for a long time, and is also the host of the DePIN podcast and has been just a gateway for tons of people to learn about and become indoctrinated to the DePIN community. So Tom, super excited to have you on today. I guess it would be awesome if you could give us a couple minutes. I know our audience would be super excited to hear about your background and to understand more about how you got to building Fluence and your path.
Certainly. Thank you. Listen, it's great to be here. Thrilled to be on the podcast. I appreciate everything you're doing in the DePIN sector. That's a help to me, help to all the projects. So thanks for all the research reports that you've been researching and doing and all the investments you're making. With regard to my path, I started off joining Mance and Lehman at Hedera Hashgraph when it was effectively a white paper. And so I helped them found and launch the public ledger, which became known as Hedera Hashgraph HBAR. And that was a incredibly intense and rewarding experience from about 2017 till 2019, where we raised a bunch of money. We launched a network. We hired a team. We brought governing council members on. And, in 2019, the token listed. And so launched the network. So it was a incredibly intense and deep learning experience. And that was my first full-time experience in crypto world. I had come from technology, but more of a finance side. I started off doing technology investment banking, did investing primarily in technology companies, primarily in the telecom sector and data sectors. And then after that, I did a variety of more business building roles at a variety of financial firms, including Goldman Sachs, where I was for about 4 or 5 years. So it was a long path to get to crypto. But from 2017 on, I've been full-time building in the space, which has been terrific. And after leaving Hedera in 19, I was introduced by an investor to Evgeny and Dmitry, the other two founders of Fluence. And I joined them very quickly in 2019 also as a third co-founder. And I've been excited to be working with them ever since.
That's awesome. My co-founder and I are also Goldman alums. We actually met. We sat next to each other in our internship at a school and then worked together for a couple of years. It's funny. Seems to be a nice cohort of former Goldman people or recovering bankers in crypto.
People ask, and I always ask, what experiences you pick up and you learn from. And I think you need to have, it's good to have some institutional background because you kind of just teaches you sort of how business operates on a professional level. But if you do it too much, then you get a little bit lazy, perhaps, and you think everything gets done for you. So you got to have some combination, I think, of startup entrepreneurial, I will get it done, roll up your sleeves. But you also have to have the experience to know how to interact with people, how to be professional, what responses are. You got to have something to kind of benchmark yourself on. And I've seen people in the space who don't have that background and purely startup, and that makes it a little bit harder to transition into some of the larger roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I'm excited to talk more about Fluence, but before that, I guess there's few builders in DePIN that have been around multiple times or around as long as you have in crypto overall. And I guess I'm curious to hear what's different the second time around. How does it feel to start a protocol in crypto 2024 version versus 2018, 2019 version?
Yeah, well, I actually roll those back and I'd say the first version was 2017, 16 version. And this version was probably the 19 version because we've been building it for a while, although we did just launch it this year. I think there was so much less known back in 2016, 17, and even when Hedera launched in 19, everything was still so early. We sort of knew it at the time, but it's so much clearer now how early that was. And I think there's more competition now, but I got to tell you, trying to recruit institutions to be part of the Hedera Governing Council was very hard because you had to have a protocol that wasn't launched, a technology, not even blockchain, right? It was not even a blockchain technology that people didn't really know, from a team people hadn't heard of, in a sector institutions were skeptical of. And so that was a very hard lift. Today, institutions at least know of Bitcoin. They're familiar with it. This space isn't going away. It's very clear they were here to stay. That was difficult. And that was not a certainty back in 2017, 18. That was a hard path, but also everything seemed possible at the time. Everything was an opportunity. Everything was going to grow. And so I think you've seen now both an easier, more institutionalization of it, but you also, I think people know there's terrific upside, but it's clear how long the road is and how hard the path is. And I think that was not quite as clear in the early days of 16, 17. And you had this weird combination of knowing that people didn't know about it, but that it was the growth was unlimited and would be soon. And I think now people, recognize that this is a bumpy road and it's going to take a while. Its path is still there, but it's a longer, harder road.
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of had my first wanting to jump into crypto full time or trying to invest in crypto full time in around 2018, 19, when the first like crypto VC funds were getting started and I was working on an endowment at the time and trying to push, people much older and with much more power than me to invest in crypto or do a small check. It was not really successful at it, but certainly the space has changed a lot. One thing I'm curious to ask you about is as the space matures, we have this gradient descent of more institutional talent, generally higher quality, more trained, I guess, from a traditional lens, of people coming into the space, but also folks are less missionary. You get less of I remember this kid, I forget his last name, but the Dylan kid, it was on Solana, early on Solana and launched Saber and a bunch of the dexes. There was these two brothers in the Solana ecosystem that had 5 billion of TVL within 3 weeks of launching their protocol back in 2021. You see less of that now than you did a number of years back. And I think those stories, whether they were sustainable or not, were really inspiring to a younger cohort of entrepreneurs and builders. Just curious, what do you think about the people that are in crypto now versus back then, or as you're hiring or also building a community, who are you trying to attract?
Well, listen, that is a tough question, but I think it's a really good one. And I think I'd answer it a couple ways. One, in the beginning, there were fewer choices of people to hire from. People didn't have experience and it was an uncertain industry. And so you didn't have many people with institutionalist backgrounds to hire from. And so you were basically having to take bets on people that didn't have an experience you could easily evaluate or a skill set that was directly applicable. So you were making real bets on people. And frankly, they were making bets as well. You fast forward, it's not as much of a risk to move into crypto. It still is a risk at a particular company or protocol level, but it's not a sector-wide risk as much. And so you see many more people with a traditional background coming into it. And that is both easier to evaluate to some extent what their capabilities are and what the value they can bring. But to your point, they also have experience where it doesn't have to work for them. And so once you've got people early on who've been hired and come in back in the previous cycle, there was not a safety net. This thing kind of had to work and they're taking real risks. And so without other alternatives. And so I think that leads to, I think what you're getting at a little bit is it leads to an intensity, and you have a little bit less potentially of that intensity now. It still exists. Don't get me wrong. In any startup field, it 100% does, but any startup company does. But that intensity level at a sector-wide basis, I think, is probably reduced a little bit as a result of the maturity and as a result of the ability to hire from people with traditional and proper experiences that have other alternatives.
Yeah. Well, so to get into Fluence a bit, maybe you could explain at a high level, how I mentioned at the beginning, Fluence, the decentralized compute network, you guys have been building it for a number of years, but recently launched. How's it different than other compute networks that we may have had on the show, or what thesis or what worldview are you guys building behind?
Sure. So we call Fluence a cloudless computing platform. And so what we mean by cloudless is a decentralized serverless compute network, which means it is resilient, and it also is resilient, fault tolerant, and also, very low cost. And I think those are important, and decentralized, obviously, those are important elements. And so the other component I think I want to distinguish with Fluence and others is it's not just a marketplace. And so marketplaces are incredibly valuable and they drive pricing down. And Fluence, a marketplace underlies the Fluence platform for sure. And that's important. But what we are doing is building a network that basically allows the compute to be provisioned by the network not just by the actual user selecting a provider. And the reason that's important, if the provider goes down, the network reprovisions that compute. And if you do that, you really commoditize the compute, because any provider becomes less important. Because if you want to shift away from, or if they go down, then it doesn't really bother you as an end user. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And that's what also drives pricing to the very lowest possible component, is if you're able to achieve that commoditization of compute. And so that is, I guess, that is a architecture that we are working on and have built. This takes lots of refinement, right? It's not like, oh, it's done, check, move on to the next. This is to make it scalable, to make it usable, to make it applicable to different applications. All this requires to productize it. All this requires additional development. That's what we're achieving and have achieved, and want to continue to basically scale up that component. So we want to commoditize compute is the bottom line, and that makes it decentralized. It also, or that is a sort of outcome of decentralization, I guess I would say. It also leads to no single points of failure, which leads to censorship resistance, and you get lots of attributes as a result of that.
So you mentioned, this not being a marketplace, but having sort of like routing and provisioning like be part of the core protocol is one of the things that allows you guys to commoditize the compute and ultimately create the most scalable network. Like why are other people not doing this, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Like what are the hardest parts about it, or some of the stuff that you guys have solved around how to work around the edge cases?
Well, listen, it is a hard thing to do, no doubt, and requires a different language. We built a language called Aqua, which allows this, basically facilitates this to happen, and allows compute to move from basically provider to provider in order to get done without having to sort of a hub and spoke kind of issue, or hub and spoke architecture. And that is a difficult thing to make work. And so that has been a lot of development over the previous years. So that's kind of the main point. I guess I should add to it also is that most marketplaces by themselves, with the amount of excess capacity out there and the ability to monetize them in discrete amounts, marketplaces are very valuable in and of themselves. So plenty of groups out there don't have a need to build this level of complexity, because marketplaces are a terrific place to start and a very valuable, solution to build. So, and to be clear, the marketplace underlies what we do as well. So marketplace is a part of what we do also. We're just trying to have be a little bit higher in the stack also in terms of this compute provisioning, which we think is ultimately important. The other thing I should add is that most groups out there are GPU network focused. We are CPU focused, CPU first. And, if you think about it, GPUs are obviously critical for training AI models. And that is an enormously significant growth area. I think that's very clear. But there are about 3 billion CPUs out there that have been created. And the CPUs still run almost every single thing that we see or do besides ChatGPT. And so there is a lot of work. Almost all work is done by CPUs. So that's where we started. That being said, we can't ignore the GPU marketplace and the GPU world and the AI world. And so we're exploring how to apply the Fluence protocol and Fluence marketplace architecture to GPUs. And I don't think it will be that difficult for us to basically adopt or accommodate the GPU kind of architecture to what we have built, but we haven't done it yet as we've been focused on CPUs.
Given that you guys, it's so differentiated what y'all are doing on the technology side in terms of what you can offer to the customers, what's your approach or strategy on the demand side? I guess one of the things that we've seen with other CPU compute networks, or one strategy, has been like go fully permissionless, and you can capture a lot of, basically get all your demand side from proof of work miners from, like Dogecoin pumps. And now you offer a free marketplace to run a Dogecoin miner on your CPU. And it sort of like becomes an escape valve for the speculation in proof of work networks. And that's, that's a market that exists today, and it's not nothing. It's lumpy, but it's concerned to be lucrative. But, I think the broader vision for DePIN is to expand beyond that into being able to serve more real world use cases and sort of like customers with more stable demand. But how are you guys thinking, not given this serverless capability that y'all have, who are the right customers for that?
Listen, I think just to put it in context for people who are not as familiar, serverless is probably a $9 billion market right now that's a forecast to grow to anywhere from 50 to 100 billion in 2030 or 2035, right? So it's a big growth in the cloud computing space. And that's because demand for compute is becoming more episodic, less predictable. And I think companies are not as inclined to rent servers and dedicate capital to servers, and are happy to pay a slight premium to only pay for the operations which they are using, right? That's what serverless is. Instead of renting the CPU or the GPU, mainly the CPUs, you are just paying for the operation when you need it, as you need it. So it's very much on-demand compute. And if you think about this, that is, it's bursty. So there's a sporting event, data analysis around a sporting event. There's a race, right? Data analysis around that. So all these types of things are useful, or they can be around, it can be compute that's not even time bound, but basically readjust to basically lower pricing. So you could do, data analysis of pharmaceuticals or drugs, and you could do that whenever the pricing is appropriate because it's not time intensive, right? So whenever CPUs become available or the pricing falls, you can then run that analysis. So there's a huge amount of serverless demand. And I think the world is becoming much more serverless oriented, just based on the sporadic and burstiness of how we consume things and the lack of predictability around it. So that's definitely happening. In terms of Fluence, we will get there. We are not there yet, but our goal here, and also just so people pay for Fluence with stable coins. And we are building even on-ramps and interfaces so you can use fiat and credit cards and don't even know there's a token behind it, right? So the goal here is to those big Web 2 traditional use cases. To get there, though, we probably start in Web 3. And then those are data cases like data cleaning, where you clean data for AI models, where you basically format the data appropriately to be ingested into the models. Those are called data pipelines. That's a multi-billion-dollar business as well. And on the clouds and on the blockchain side, as you kind of referenced, one thing we're looking at is not necessarily proof of work, but there's a variety of proof of stake protocols that want to run private networks that need lots of computation and are looking at deploying on Fluence because of the lower cost. We're probably about 80% less than the serverless cost of the cloud. And so I think our early users are going to be either AI and or kind of proof of stake kind of node running, if you will, where there is sort of significant computation required. Those are kind of the early use cases.
What can we look forward to and to watch out for Fluence? Like what are you guys in terms of like timing and what folks can look forward to over the next couple of quarters, months, years that you guys are working on now?
Well, there's a couple of things coming on that I think are important. So first, we built this in WASM, and that started off in 2019 when we thought WASM would have a ton of language support. And this gets kind of technical, but they basically are just supporting Rust, and that's a limitation for deployment. So we're looking at adding Docker support. So that's going to be a big enhancement to use case adoption, is adding Docker. But most importantly, I think, is we're launching staking probably in September, and we're launching a staking campaign in July and later this month. And I think that is important. And I think with just a minute on token economics, because I think this is pretty important, is we have what I think is a pretty different token model, but I think it's very relevant. And we can actually, curious your perspective on this, given all the projects you've looked at. But the way Fluence operates is we know that the miners and the compute providers have expenses in fiat. So we have to reward them in a predictable amount. And that's not a predictable amount of FLT, because who knows what the value of FLT is. So we actually reward miners for adding compute, or reward compute providers by giving them about $10 per core per month, which is about $600 per 64 core CPU per month in FLT. And so if FLT moves, that reward in number of FLT changes. And that moves by a max of 10% a day. But the idea is and then there's vesting, right? So you're never going to get exactly that amount. It could be more, could be less, but at least it's approximating that. And then to stake, which provides trust, the investors stake $200 per core, about $12,000 per CPU. And so you end up having an economy that's denominated in FLT or paid in FLT, but denominated in dollars. And so that means if I can tell you, and you know the amount of compute and CPUs that will be on the Fluence network, you know quite clearly the demand for FLT. And so the extent we get to, 1,000 CPUs on the network, and we have demand for far more than that, that will require $12 million worth of FLT stake. The size of one Amazon data center, 50,000 CPUs, would require $600 million of FLT stake. And so that, to me, is an interesting model, because it allows you to to kind of understand and come back to an actual core value as to what some demand will be. And it's done to protect the network, right? Because if the stake was just an FLT, if FLT is worth nothing, the stake's worth nothing, and then you don't have any security, right? So you need to have this amount that comes back to a value, we think, and then rewards people in that value down the road. And so this is a long way to answer your question, that we're starting staking in September. And so we're going to be onboarding CPUs, and we've onboarded a small number of CPUs so far, but we're going to start to onboard more scale starting in September, and they'll have the opportunity for the community to stake to allow these CPUs on the network.
In the DePIN 1.0 tokenomics version, let's just take Helium or Filecoin as an example. There was these halving element whereby there was a deep incentive to be early, sort of because of this halving nature of the emissions that exists when you're doing this dollar denominated but token settled method. You lose a lot of this early sort of asymmetric upside for the earliest supporters of the network or earliest miners on the network, and maybe, I think that's by design. But just curious, how do you think about accelerating the earliest, 100,000, 10,000 providers on the network without this?
It's undeniably right that early, miners for Picket, Helium, or Filecoin did terrifically well. But the problem is, particularly with Filecoin, you can do so well early on that you're not interested in actually serving real customers, because you're making so much from those rewards. You don't want to deal or bother with customers. You have no incentive to accommodate or deal with them. And so when we were designing this protocol, we talked to a variety of miners and said, listen, your problem isn't only the price falls and people can't support their network and can't support their cost. The problem is the price goes up so much, they don't want to do any actual work. And so we wanted to design something where we attracted people that view this as utility and are not just in it for a moonshot in terms of return. But the important thing I wanted to distinguish here is that it resets. But, pick a number now. Our market cap is, say, 400 million, right? Tokens 30 cents. That gives you XFLT. In a year, if you hold those in a year, if we're successful and we've onboarded a lot more compute, the actual tokens you've received could be worth many multiples of that. So your reward goes up by the amount the value of the network goes up. So you have the potential to do incredibly well. It is just not quite as levered. It's not two levers. Like the Filecoin, you're levered because you got a lot of tokens that can go up. With Fluence, you're getting a set amount of tokens potentially that we also think as the network grows, the demand increases, that could increase significantly in value also. But it's not a double levered, if you will, for being early. And that's because we want people who are in this for the long term. And also, just to give you a sense, when you're a compute provider, your rewards vest over 6 months, and you have to be providing compute for those 6 months in order to get those tokens vested and released. So we're really trying to build kind of this utility type model here.
Makes sense. I mean, we were doing the math on this internally a couple weeks ago, so the numbers might be outdated. But I think even today, if you look at Filecoin's revenue over the past 3-4 months, it's 85-90% of it is slashing penalties from providers who are not, like Filecoin burn, like what they show is on-chain revenue. It's really just all slashing penalties from providers who are not providing service and are giving up a portion of their stake that they may, put up who knows when. So that makes sense. How are you guys thinking about slashing? Or because it's, it's not a marketplace, you don't have as much of this long duration need for providers to hold up stake and slash them. You can technically, because it's serverless, you can sort of pay people based on every load of compute, right? Not based on a 12-month lease like Filecoin. And so how do you guys deal with staking, slashing, verification, those sorts of issues?
The way the commitments work is you make a commitment for a period of time, and that's month to 6 months. And over that period of time, you can either be earning proof of compute rewards where you're actually demonstrating and proving the compute's available, or you can serve actual compute jobs for which are paid by developers, by customers in stablecoins. And so some compute providers will actually prefer that because there's no vesting, right? If they serve a compute job, they get paid immediately for that job in stablecoin or effectively in fiat, depending on the interface. And there's no vesting. And so they may even charge less than they would make in Fluence tokens for proof of compute because there's no vesting. They may charge more if they want Fluence coins. It's a marketplace, right? So we'll see. But if they terminate that commitment early, then stake is impacted. But the other important piece here is the interesting thing is that commitment is denominated, again, in dollars paid in FLT. So if FLT goes up when you recommit, same dollar amount, but you now have the tokens to be able, the tokens are worth more, right? So you've got excess to do that. Token, if it goes down, it requires you to buy more tokens to do that. And so we think that's also a stabilizing factor as well, as these commitments continually roll. But if the token goes down, there's probably more token demand from commitments. Token goes up, there's less, but the token is up anyway. So that's, I think, an interesting mechanism that I want to see play out scale, because other providers, I think, are more percentage focused as opposed to actually linking it to something specific. So I'm very curious to see, if this plays out the way we're expecting it.
One other thing I think, curious to ask you about how y'all are thinking through the token, not the protocol design side of it. We've seen this shift in DePIN more broadly, or we're seeing it happen in real time towards, I think, like sort of a pushback against like community run governance or token voting, or not decentralization, but really just like the governance and decision making side of it. And like earlier this week, Michael, who started Pocket it was called Grove now, the company that started the Pocket network, is sort of like making a governance attempt to take over control of the foundation for a year, and basically have like, a la carte or carte blanche rights to push changes to the protocol and sort of like run the foundation for a period of time. And he makes this pretty compelling argument that they decentralized the Pocket network way too early, and that they sort of like took these signs of success in the form of increasing Pocket token price and increasing number of daily relays as success. But it turned out that actually there were these like diverging sort of like paths that the network was taking, and it wasn't as cohesive as or he argues it's not as cohesive as what people think, and so they need to re-centralize sort of like the governance. We see something similar happening in Helium with the sub-DAOs. Like while Helium has a vision of being a network of networks, all the sub-DAOs today are run effectively by Nova Labs, by the centralized company. And it's been that we actually, they'll announce a new sub-DAO soon by an external party. But a big part of the adverse selection that they faced is that it's, as an entrepreneur, like, why join a broader network and, for example, become a Helium sub-DAO if you have to give up rights to how you run your business to a community that, who knows how much they know about your business or about your industry or aligned with you or whatever else. How do you guys think decentralization of governance is a good thing, or decision making? Like what do you want to empower your community to do versus not, is I guess the question that I'm asking.
Listen, I think governance is a fascinating question, and we've spent a lot of time on it. Frankly, I spent a ton of time on it at Hedera to build a governing council. And, governing council, people are upset about it. Some people at Hedera think, or the community says that's centralized. But the key part is that there are term limits in that council. And that allows you to eliminate that kind of stasis or entrenched interest. And so I think that was a key piece that some people have missed. But that carried over that kind of learning into Fluence. We've structured this as a DAO, and with a wrapper in Switzerland, it's an association. And so as much is on-chain controlled as possible. But we have a governance committee has been delegated a variety of duties, and that governance committee can veto the DAO, but the DAO votes in that governance committee every 2 years. So ultimately, the DAO controls everything, including the governance committee, which is just there to provide basically a break and a sanity check in case there's rogue votes effectively. But what I think our protocol is young too, but what we've just entering into now is a long-term software services agreement with Cloudless Labs, which is sort of like the Nova Labs equivalent in Helium, which is the development partner. And so that pays Cloudless Labs for continuing to develop the protocol. And so the question becomes, to your point, how many on-chain votes will be required, and how much time will it take to pass those votes in, say, 2 years from now, when the network is really decentralized and there are a lot of holders. And that I'm not sure about, but our objective here is to do broad stroke delegation. And so for the community to be able to delegate and have proposals to delegate development to one company, development to 3 companies, whatever it is, right? Hopefully many more, but not to have to vote for every single specific upgrade and every single specific kind of development, because I think that becomes unworkable. But it is important, particularly for US, I think, regulations, that you have decentralized governance and you allow other groups to become instrumental in not just governing, but also building the network. And if you don't have that, you run all kinds of other regulatory and other risks. And so I think that is another kind of important driver for us to do it. But we also want the community to be able to have a real share and real voice in doing this. And they have so far. We've passed a couple of proposals already since we launched this in March. And the community's been involved, and we're going to continue down that path. I think you can be much more effective if you're one person in control. I think that's hard to debate. The problem is you can also do all kinds of things wrong, and you can also take all kinds of advantage of it, right? And so, I think that in early days, I think it makes sense to be centralized, but the bigger and broader you get, I think you're going to need to have more and more input and involve more and more people to build it. I just think it's just in this world, I think that's harder and harder to get away from. And it's other point I'll mention is it's hard to want the benefits of decentralization and a token economy, but then not want to pay the price in terms of what that governance means. It's hard to get one without the other. And I think that's there's huge benefits to having a token and token economy. I think part of the cost of that is this part of the relevance there is the community, and then giving the community share in governance. I think that's a very that's sort of what the trade-off is, I think.
I 100% agree. And I like this point that you made around term limits, and I think like giving stronger like delegated authority to teams, but over shorter periods of time. I think it will be the natural like end state of how governance ends up looking, which is like how we do democracy and other things. So I guess it shouldn't be that surprising, but it seems to not be what this space has coalesced on so far.
Well, no, and people have taken this and have spent, the other way I look at this also is that people spend so much time developing the technology, and then governance has in many cases taken 5% of the mind share of that, less. And so then you can't be surprised if some of that doesn't work out well or isn't functioning as expected, because it just hasn't been the attention focused on it. And so I think that is a little bit of an issue where if you're spending this much effort and time building this economic system and software protocols, you got to think about the governance, because otherwise you run the risk of it going to waste. But that takes me also to think about, you mentioned the other protocols. Love to hear about your investing in the space, and you've raised now 2 funds, I think, in the space, one illiquid, one liquid, or one venture and one liquid. Love to hear about kind of how you got there. Obviously, learned about you first from the Masari reports that you authored. So love to hear about your path, and then we can talk about some investments or sectors you like.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, we've had the good fortune to be around DePIN for a while, and so get to meet a lot of the founders who are making a huge impact and make a lot of friends. And it's been an awesome path these past couple of years. So I run Escape Velocity with a co-founder. His name's Mahesh. We sort of arrived at the space from like completely different angles. We were both investing in crypto personally for a long time. For me, the obsession with DePIN came from a place of like decentralization, maximalism, or just like libertarianism, I guess. I thought, hey, we have this global decentralized world computer. What does that mean if you can't access the internet in a permissionless way? I'm from Venezuela. Like we saw when the government basically took over Venezuela, like the first things they did, you literally saw like you could be watching the news anchors and you saw like the military like show up to all the like news outlets and basically like take over the broadcasting and take over the internet, the ISPs. And so it was clear to me, like, if we want the crypto to develop in a way that's congruent with like how we see the 50-year vision of this permissionless sort of like global internet, then we had to access the internet in a permissionless way. And so decentralized wireless and mesh networking like really nerd-sniped me, and I got obsessed with how do we build peer-to-peer wireless networks. As part of that, me and Mahesh both got into the Filecoin and Helium communities, and some others are early in 2020, 2021-ish. And not many people were focused on this area back then. There was a lot of attention going into sort of like blockchain scaling, a lot of attention going into DeFi and financial services, but very little going into how do we create sort of like next-gen businesses that take either like fiat-denominated or commodity-denominated cash flows and build really strong networks around it. And we had both been investing sort of out of larger investment firms in the past couple of years. And what we recognized was that these networks could be like extremely good businesses, the best businesses we had ever seen if you looked at them from an investing lens, in the sense that they could be massively capital efficient, they could scale extremely quickly. These markets were trillions of dollars. And so we were just like looking at each other confused around why no investors were paying attention to the space, despite the fact that we saw this like an extremely asymmetric opportunity to back networks at the earliest stage who could fundamentally just underpin like a new generation of internet infrastructure. And so yeah, in 2022 we sort of like went off on our own and raised. At that point there was no like DePIN term or space or like global community. And so we raised a venture fund because the opportunity was really to back pre-seed, seed, a couple of Series A companies and like Web 2 companies that were going into crypto. But the opportunity was to back new networks and help start new ideas and incubate them. And so that's what we did. We this year just raised a DePIN liquid token fund because we see this massive, there's probably going to be 250, 300 new DePIN token launches over the next year. We unfortunately are just two guys and didn't get every great network out of our venture fund. I wish we would have. We got a lot of them, but a couple like Fluence and others that we weren't able to. We want to have the opportunity. We think these networks still have 100x type growth potential if DePIN works the way that we think it can over a long period of time. And so the opportunity today we feel is really compelling in liquid networks, and there's a lot of informational sort of like asymmetry that you can get as an investor by being actively participating, using these networks, being validators on them, knowing the founders, being in the communities, helping to run governance in some cases, or running these different experiments. And so we have built a firm around basically trying to position ourselves as partners to DePIN communities. We built a bunch of open source tools as a part of doing that, including DePIN Ninja, which is an analytics aggregator where you can see on-chain stats, and sort of like we're tracking almost 1,400 DePIN projects today globally around the world. We do put a lot of effort into helping to evangelize DePIN in the media and reports and research, and so we partner with Nasari on stuff on some stuff. We have we have this proof of coverage podcast and a few other efforts, and we also one of the most fun things last year we did was host this annual conference right after the Science of Blockchain conference called DePIN Summit, where we basically last year had like 150 DePIN founders and investors come and have a highly curated audience, and we saw probably like 10 or 15 mil of capital raises come out of the events. We saw a bunch of new partnerships, and part I'm most proud of probably a couple of founders who came in as Web 2 or Web 2 infrastructure founders and left as DePIN founders planning to pivot into DePIN. So we're going to do it again this year in August in New York City. I'm super excited for that and spending some time planning for it today. But yeah, that's how we view the world and what we've been up to for the past couple of years.
It's super interesting. Well, a lot of different places to go with that, but I guess one thing we've talked about a little bit is token economics. That's something I always focus on in my podcast in detail. And I think you've said finding the right DePIN project with the right token economics is challenging. And so can you talk a little bit about token economics and kind of what you look for and kind of what you don't see in many?
I think we're still, I would say, like in the process of figuring out what the end state of DePIN tokenomics are. We're like in the second inning. They're still fairly primitive, and there's a lot of experiments to run. And so it's something we spend a lot of time on with our founders. To be frank, at the stage we're investing in, it's not something we expect companies to have figured out, given how early we're investing in the venture fund. In the liquid markets, it is something we spend a lot of time thinking about these networks. And our base view is, I would describe it this way. We're big believers in actually the separation of governance and economic rights. Like crypto as a whole has been extremely focused on linking up these two things. And we think that they're like oil and vinegar. They just fundamentally, you get these very perverse dynamics in networks when you link these together. And the reason why we've had to do that is because you have, because of regulatory issues, and everyone's trying to avoid being classified as a security, you sort of like have to have your token holders like do something in order to not be classified as security. And what's the like lightest touch thing that they can do? Governance, right? And so you embed all these governance rights into users, which probably don't have a strong perspective on how to govern your protocol or why, or maybe aren't long-term incentivized. And this, I think, is actually one of the things that has slowed down the space the most over the past number of years, and that we really need to solve in order to get to like the DePIN 2.0 or 3.0. And so we're big advocates of doing these sorts of like term limit type ideas that you mentioned. Basically, let's minimize governance overhead and let the teams cook. Like they should just, being a DePIN founder is so hard. Like these people that are committed to it and doing their lives and raise money for it. And like, let's just like let the teams actually innovate on what they're doing. And governance is extremely important. I think it's critical to have veto rights and avoid misaligned incentives or have a way to punish like fraud and bad actors in the space. But I just think there's, governance like has devolved to micromanagement and sort of like plundering of treasuries. There's so much in DeFi and layer ones, and I really think we can do better through more of a system of how I think we're both thinking around. Basically, let's have very well defined, like tightly defined governance rights. They don't need to be light. They can be extremely heavy in sense of like completely replacing the governance council every year or every 2 years, but they can't be overly burdensome, and they I think should be separated from the economics of the network. Like I think staking for like vote escrow, staking for governance rights is also very broken. Like many people who want to earn yield on their tokens don't care about governance. Like, I run a liquid fund now, and we basically looked around and we're like, why would we stake any, like, I don't give a shit about these governance. Like, realistically, like we might have to sell our tokens at any time in the next 6 months if our investors redeem. Like, that's the reality of running a hedge fund structure. And like, I don't get paid any extra for governance rights. Like, they mean absolutely nothing to us. It's just the reality of the incentives. And so we're running a bunch of experiments in parallel right now across a number of our portfolio companies around effectively like how can we be a lot more thoughtful around minimizing governance overhead. And we think that will make these protocols much more efficient with capital and with time.
Definitely interesting. I think that the governance is something that I know what you're referencing, where the longer you lock your coins up for, the more multiplier effect you get in your tokens. And I can see intellectually why that makes sense, because the protocol would want more long term. The longer term you're committed, presumably the more you're aligned with the success of the project. That makes some sense. Unclear if that is ultimately the best way to go. We didn't implement that in Fluence, but we certainly thought about it. And in terms of economics, what I see a lot are people who are groups that understand where the token isn't aligned exactly with the growth of the network. And the tragedy will be is if you have some super successful networks, but the tokens don't actually participate in that. And that will be a real shame. The thing I sort of think about is it should be all about the token, because if it's not, another generation project will come around and make it all about the token, and then they'll have access to capital, and that will grow dramatically and maybe overtake the one that didn't think about it from that perspective. And, especially people with a Web 2 background, token can sometimes be kind of an add-on as opposed to like a core component of the project.
I think I agree. I'm like 80-20. I flip back and forth a lot because I'm like, what are the lessons we learned from layer ones? It's like, I don't know that, like there's this obviously this argument around like Solana and Ethereum, where like the Ethereum community has put a lot of sort of like research effort and just mind share behind this like idea of moneyness, or, having their token be base money of the ecosystem. I don't know that that's when we look at the market, I guess the market will speak for us in a long enough time frame. But there's, the Ethereum community sort of like says this about Solana, like, there's this massive issuance. It's sort of like overly diluted for the network. They can't afford these low transaction fees are like artificially subsidized, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I don't know that actually it's played out that way. But maybe layer ones are a special case, just given how much of like a premium you get for what it could become. So yeah, I agree with you, but it's a paranoia we have a lot around. Well, maybe we could be wrong.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, any projects that you are particularly excited about that part of the portfolio or maybe in it?
One space that I've been really fired up about recently and spent a lot of time on this year is decentralized energy. I think this has been sort of a meme in the past, and energy markets are really hard to understand. And so there's been mostly around like carbon credit type innovations, but we think now is actually the time where there are certain wedges in the energy market that you can build really compelling network effects around. A lot of it is around energy data. Like, today, the visibility that anyone has into the state of the grid at any given point in time is pretty poor. Maybe certain, like in Texas or something, you might have like better data access, but by and large, it's very, very hard to get a real-time view of like what's happening in the grid. And that causes all sorts of friction where you can't effectively offload, like cancel or settle like energy from one place to another, and generally a ton of inefficiencies. And so there's two ways that we think crypto can really help accelerate the energy industry. One is exactly this, like let's get real-time cryptographically verified data on the state of the grid. We can apply smart meters on your home, or maybe smart plugs in between the large appliances in your house, or maybe we connect your thermostat through an API, or we connect your car through an API, or many different types of sensors that you can measure current through. But once we have this, we can start to coalesce this picture around like what's the grid doing at any given state of time. And there are many, many businesses, developers who might build apps on top of data that way that can't exist today. And we're investors in a project called Daylight, which is building this vision out here in the US and has some really exciting stuff in the works for later this summer, but I'm not going to dox them right now. The other protocol in this space that is doing really interesting things is one called Glow. It's you may know the founder, David Vorak. He founded SIA before. He's been in the compute space for a while.
Yeah, I've had him on the podcast, and I've spoken to him, so I think he's terrific.
Yeah, they're the best. Well, we're aggressively mining Glow right now. Like, spent a lot of our it reminded me of the helium days when we were making friends, like climbing roofs and signing real estate deals and mining. We were sort of doing that again now with Glow and helping to get solar panels spun up on the network. The way Glow works is effectively a competition for new solar farms to create carbon credits. Solar carbon credits have not existed in the past because it's very hard to prove incrementality, meaning solar can be profitable on its own. And so it's hard to convince somebody that, hey, we installed this solar panel only because you funded it with carbon credits. Therefore, like they have, these carbon credits have some value and did good in the world. The way that Glow solves this is by having making people put up a very large stake behind their solar panels. This stake sort of like gets competed or redistributed depending on who creates the most carbon credits. And they actually send an inspector to your house, or they call it an auditor, but basically an inspector to your house before and after the installation to make sure that, hey, these solar panels were not here before the Glow protocol. They were here immediately after these guys paid anywhere from like a $20,000 to $100,000 or even like a few $100,000 protocol fee for like a residential solar installation. And so there's maybe like 25 farms on the Glow network today, mostly homes. It's like in the days of Bitcoin when you could mine on your home laptop, right? Like very, very low difficulty. This is changing pretty quickly. Now there's like small farms getting onboarded. There's like small businesses, solar installers onboarding homes en masse. And so we see the same aspect of like how quickly Bitcoin mining institutionalized and became like, the world's largest supercomputer. This could become the same thing with Glow, where they just attract a massive amount of new solar panels onto their network to participate in this game. And, as a function of that, are able to create like a ton of carbon credits and good for the world, be good for society. So this is an area that we think is particularly difficult to build in, just given the nature of the industry. But we think there will be some really, really special protocols built there. So we've been spending a bunch of time trying to understand them and, participate in those networks.
Listen, love that project. And the one thing I'd add about that is that DePIN overall is very good at generating supply. It's been less good, just broadly speaking, at getting the demand. And the thing about Glow, one of the aspects that I find unique about it is that the demand for carbon credits is kind of clear, and their ability, I think, to sell those to one or two buyers is pretty clear. So it's kind of the reverse of a lot of projects where the demand side is almost more or less taken care of, at least as far as I understand it. And then they're just building up the supply, and the economics will drive the supply over time. So I'm not worried about that side either. But solving that demand, the only other one I know doing it super well is Spexy, which is doing drone mapping of the U.S. initially, and there's a ton of demand for that drone mapping. So those are two components that the two projects I think are doing have that demand side taken care of, which is not a given for every project out there.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think another thing that we'll see besides these networks like Spexy and Glow is also, Web 2 companies that sort of like have built some sort of critical mass of demand and are then decide to tokenize. We've done a few of these, like company Nosh Delivery that's doing food delivery, and they basically like took over a couple of towns in Colorado where they kicked out DoorDash and do most of the food delivery there, and are now decentralizing, and a handful of others that we've done around that space, including Andrina on the wireless home internet side.
Super interesting. Well, yeah, listen, and the other element I think that I'll mention about Glow, and you're probably deep in this, but the ability to realize that they can launch and drive even the supply side themselves by helping funds start that subsidize the deployment of the solar, right? And so then to me, that is analogous to Elon Musk creating Starlink, which is his biggest customer of SpaceX, right? So he created his customer. And in a way, I see Glow's kind of fund is doing the same thing, is analogous to that, where they're creating basically the demand for the Glow, or the supply for the Glow protocol by funding some of that solar development, which I think is fascinating. So love both those aspects of that project.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to see them become more public and get out of, they're in guarded launch right now, but I think it should be over maybe next month or the end of this month, actually, when they're going fully live.
Any comments you would have for projects that you would like to see, you don't see in the space? Anything you'd say to entrepreneurs out there, and also a separate question, but to investors out there, what to look for? So you could hit both those or one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's hard. My general view on venture investing is that it's one of these things, like you got to see the future, the present really clearly. It's less about seeing the future, and so I don't know that we've like historically done very well when we like try to ideate on ideas and versus being really open-minded about what could become and just trying to meet really special entrepreneurs. the things we do, I guess, in terms of emerging areas outside of energy, we're spending more time on sort of like wearables and healthcare and data. The space as a whole is testing out whether these models where you collect a large amount of data and then train AI on it and then figure out some way to monetize it is like a viable business model. So Grass, which is sort of like a residential IP leasing network that allows data scrapers to operate on your computer. They just released a huge data set of text data. There's a company called Frodobots that is like a sidewalk robot driving game around the world where you can basically remote into a little sidewalk robot and drive around. Like I'm on Eastern time, so in the morning Eastern or at night Eastern time, you can drive around in like the sunrise in Wuhan, and you can drive these little sidewalk robots around Wuhan. It's a lot of fun. They have about 5 or 10,000 hours of sidewalk robot video data, which is one of the biggest open source already data sets of actually like robotics, of non like road driving mobility robotics data. And so they're working with DeepMind and doing a big hackathon around like allowing, robotics devs to use this to build AI applications. And so if this model works, I think it can be extremely powerful, because imagine, we can do the same thing for healthcare, for example. Like maybe we train a model on everyone's like smart ring data or their wearables data. And you could, maybe in logistics, like you could track things or create some train models around like the shortest path routing algorithm of like shipping real-time goods and things like that. We're really trying to focus on, if the space can solve monetization, this is one way to solve monetization, is just like collecting a shit ton of data and then training an AI model. And it can solve governance. I think the sky's the ceiling, but these are the two areas that we're laser focused on solving that are, common to like every DePIN project right now. In terms of for investors, I guess, I don't know, DePIN, we've been harping on DePIN for so long now. Our entire beings now are indexed as like the success of the space. It's really interesting. When we started EV3, the sort of like pushback we got from investors was like, didn't Helium already win this? Like the view, in early or late 2021 was like, well, Helium already like has this, huge market cap. They can create now sub DAOs. Like, are there more investable opportunities around the space? And is there more than just DY? And, as sort of like the space started growing and as like Helium price declined in 2023, the question turned to like, okay, well, Helium doesn't seem to be working. Now, like, how do you know that anything in DePIN can work? And once we got over that hump, there was this question of, is there even enough here for you to invest in, right? Like that there's like maybe there was 50 companies in 2022. How can you build a venture fund in a space with 50 companies? And now I think it's clear that the number of different DePIN companies that could exist is massive, just because we already have 1,400 today, and we're still seeing these emerging areas that are just beginning to grow. It's clear that these networks can have flywheels that grow much quicker than anything in Web 2, because we've seen it in Helium IoT, we've seen it with a bunch of compute networks, we've seen it with Bitcoin. And so that part feels de-risked. And it's clear that, given some trade-offs on decentralization, people can get real utility out of these networks. Like people are using DePIN products today at scale, and they're useful and they're low cost. And so these three things I think are clear for investors. That the space definitely like has heated up a lot over the past year. And so for investors deploying capital now, the question is like, the temptation, I guess, for a lot of investors, like, let's back like the third or fourth team copying. Like if X team does this thing really well, then, let's back the other one. Maybe they get to half the size and half the valuation, but I still made money if I did it early enough. I think this is a really dangerous temptation for investors. Like we're big believers in like category leaders or investing in something that's unique. It's gotten incredibly easy to launch a token in terms of the cost, but incredibly difficult to like capture attention and mind share and build a community. And I think entrepreneurs are like conflating these two things as they, see that it's easy to launch a token, but they sort of like underestimate now how big they have to get in order to like get to escape velocity in terms of their ecosystem. And so, there will be consolidation in the space. And I think investors need to think really hard around, is this thing that I'm back? Are they doing something new? Like, are we learning something from this experiment, or are they just like copying somebody else in DePIN and the space as a whole is not being pushed forward much?
Listen, yeah, I hear that. And that's actually an interesting thing to think about. I got two comments on the first is, you can look at the Web 2 and you can see Yahoo and MySpace as Gen 1s that were easily supplanted by other Gen 2 companies. Does that happen to DePIN? Or do you have Amazons and eBays that were Gen 1 and have succeeded? And I'll bet you, just like Web 2, we're going to see certain verticals for which either the economics or the token economics or whatever, the team wasn't appropriate, and Gen 2 may actually surpass them. But there are also maybe some category killers there that do win. And by the way, the one thing that's come out recently for you to support the comment about how these communities are difficult, you may have seen the Polkadot Treasury report. I don't know if you saw that, but I think they were spending $10 million a month in online marketing. And I don't know about you, but I have not been flooded with Polkadot marketing. So, I mean, that was shocking to me. And that just shows the amount of money that you can spend if you have it, and unclear what that is generating.
Yeah, I saw I think they actually paid $50,000 for an animated logo on CoinMarketCap for 6 months to be the only project with an animated logo on CoinMarketCap for the first 6 months, which is just hilarious.
Anyway, so that just shows you the token is not the end. That's just the beginning.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, one more question for you, and I meant to start with this, but you've been in the space a long time. How do you define DePIN? Because if we don't have a definition, it's going to get diluted to nothing. So how do you define it?
I think this will be controversial. Well, there's two definitions that I like. One is a network where, and I'm pretty sure I got this from Amir from Helium, a network where if you put all the nodes in a single warehouse, it would not be valuable. And so it speaks to sort of like a network where there's fundamentally benefits to geographic distribution of nodes. And I think this is a good, this sort of like differentiates between some compute networks where maybe it is actually, and maybe they're not DePIN, but we're calling them DePIN today, compute networks where if you put them all in a single data center, it would still be valuable. That's obviously not the case with radios. It's not the case for anything where latency matters globally. It's not the case for things where you need global coverage to get data. And so I think all these things would fall into DePIN. The original definition that I used from an investment perspective was networks where their core economics are denominated either in fiat or in the digital commodity, like in flops or in gigabytes or whatever. When we revenue in any network is volume times price per unit, volume of units times price per unit. And so in most of crypto, like pre-2021 crypto outside of DePIN, both of these things are highly reflexive to crypto cycles, right? Like your price per transaction, your gas fees are levered to crypto cycles, and also your amount of on-chain activity for layer one is also levered to crypto cycles. Same with in a DEX, like your average trade size is levered to crypto cycles, and the number of trades that are going through a DEX are also levered to crypto cycles. So you get this deep reflexivity both up and down, which I think is easy to underestimate both the magnitude of it, both on the way up and also on the way down. With DePIN, our original definition was, okay, these are networks where at least one of these factors is not entirely correlated to crypto cycles. Either the price per unit of this thing is pretty standard, meaning like a gigabyte is a gigabyte, no matter what the price of Bitcoin is on any given day, or the usage of them is fairly decoupled, right? Like if we have people using Helium mobile cell phone plans, probably they'll use them the same amount regardless of what Bitcoin price does on any given day. And this is what led us to the insight to think that these networks are some of the most powerful businesses ever, because you can get the upside of reflexivity, and when there is speculation pumped into the networks, there's a way to transform that into real utility and value for the network and use that to build productive infrastructure. But on the downside, you still have these core network activity that's not completely entirely coupled to DePIN to crypto volumes and revenues and reflexivity. And so that was our definition. I think it has expanded a bit to probably the most controversial ones were things like blockchain infra companies, like maybe like Pocket, and the RPC networks, or like Chainlink and Oracles, which are either, I think of those as inverses of each other. You're either bringing off-chain data on-chain or bringing on-chain data off-chain. But from first principles, and also when you run the math on sort of correlating it to crypto cycles, you see that they're sort of half DePINs, right? They their volumes they go down still in bear markets, but not as much as DEX volumes, not as much as layer one transaction volumes. But RPC volumes do decrease in bear markets because there's less developer activity. And so we've come to include these things under the DePIN umbrella, though I think of them as half DePINs using our original criteria of are these networks, is the core service that these networks are providing fiat or commodity denominated and not crypto denominated.
Yeah, I mean, and I see some of those as almost DePIN providers or DePIN adjacent to some extent. But the definition that I like, and I like because I sort of came up with it. Tell me what you think is sort of a crowdsourced physical infrastructure bound together in a software network, secured and incented by crypto economics.
I like it.
And so, right, that kind of covers it. It doesn't take block production out of it, although I would. But I feel like that at least covers. You got to have the crypto incentives. You got to have a physical network, and you got to have a common network, on a software network on top of it. I think that's broad enough, but we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. Sometimes the thing that hits people is like, or what I use for traditional Web2 folks is just like, a combination open source hardware and software that's linked together cryptographically. And I think, if we think of crypto broadly as open source software, then we just need to add the hardware element to it and we get DePIN.
Fair enough. Well, listen, been a super fun conversation. It's been great being on Proof of Coverage, and thank you for being on DePIN.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun joint episode. Appreciate it, Tom.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening to the Proof of Coverage podcast. We'll be posting one new episode a week on Mondays, interviewing the best DePIN and crypto founders out there. If you like this episode, please follow us on Twitter or X at CoverageProved or on any major podcasting platform. Thank you.